Welcome, everyone. I'm Mike Parham. I am the former chair of the life science sector, currently a board member of LES USA Canada. Thank you all for joining us for this talk. We're honored today to have Lorraine Marchand. She's an author, speaker, and innovation consultant who will be talking to us about the innovation mindset, which is the subject of her book. So Lorraine is a business and innovation and strategic growth advisor with over 30 years experience in new product development, innovation, commercialization, data and AI, and digital transformation. She's held leadership positions at IBM, Bristol Myers Squibb, LabCorp, IQVIA, and other companies, and she's co-founded 4 companies. She is currently an adjunct professor of management and serves on the Healthcare and Pharmaceutical Management Program Advisory Board at Columbia Business School and is an adjunct professor of innovation and entrepreneurship at Yeshiva University's Katz School of Science and Health. Her book, The Innovation Mindset, 8 Essential Steps to Transform Any Industry, published by Columbia Business School, won the 2023 Gold Medal Axiom Business Book Award. She was the 2014 recipient of the Pennsylvania Governor's Hannah Penn Leadership Award. So thank you, Lorraine, for joining us today. We're anxious to hear from you about everything that you've thought about and discovered. This is an interactive talk, so please join in and provide questions. We'll be monitoring those on the interface here, and we'll have some interactive questions throughout the talk. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Lorraine.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate that kind introduction. And thank you, Stacy, also for your facilitation and all your support putting this program together. It's wonderful to meet you all virtually. And I know that your society represents a number of sectors. Having grown up in the life sciences and the healthcare sector, a number of my case examples do speak to that sector, but I hope that there will be something in this talk for everyone. And if you can think about it in a couple ways, our objectives here are threefold. One is to give you some food for thought about your own innovation mindset. So as licensing professionals, IP professionals, clearly you have internal customers, but what I oftentimes find is that individuals in these types of facilitation roles, support roles, decision roles also want to have very strong innovation skills. So we'll have an opportunity to discuss that. Certainly, we want to understand innovation in a corporate environment, and I have some content to share with you around what I call the 5 C's, a framework for really breaking down and understanding corporate innovation. It's actually the subject of the second book that I'm working on, No Fear, No Failure, which will be published by Columbia Business School next year. And then finally, as professionals, I know that you want to take away some pearls of wisdom, things that you can think about applying to your situation, to your companies, to your customers. So I'm hoping that we will touch on all of that. I have a lot of content. We don't have to go through it all. I've organized it into chunks that I think are going to be most relevant. And I'm going to stop along the way, ask you questions, give a little time for thought and for discussion, and Mike is going to assist me by facilitating the chat and making sure that we talk about what's most important to you. So as we get started here, it's very important to define innovation. There are a lot of myths. There are a lot of definitions, and as of last year, it was one of the most frequently cited terms in all of McKinsey's database. So a lot is written and talked about in terms of innovation. What I like to do is debunk some of these myths, and I'll explain why. It's not an aha moment, and Mike, this will be the first quiz. Does anybody know how many filaments Thomas Edison tested before he actually innovated the final one that was in the light bulb that was taken to market? And obviously the light bulb, there are a number of innovators that have touched the light bulb. There's a famous light bulb in the Fire Engine Museum in California. But does anybody want to guess how many filaments Edison may have tested?
Don't be shy. Put it in the chat or in the question.
Usually we have some Edison aficionados. All right. Well, if we don't have anybody who wants to guess, it was about 2000. So clearly not an aha moment, right? 2000, a lot of toiling, a lot of testing, a lot of process in order to get to that final filament. A number of individuals, and we'll see some famous faces here in a moment, think it's only about sexy new technologies or unicorns such as the Googles and the Amazons and the Magnificent Seven. And now we have the EU granolas and we have Uber and Airbnb. It's not relegated to them as well. In fact, those types of innovations, as we'll see, make up only about 1% of all innovation. And then finally, for those of us who are fond of the Steve Jobs of the world, it's oftentimes associated with code wranglers in Silicon Valley and eccentric billionaires. And when I work with students, which as you can tell I do at the undergrad and grad level, this is a lot of times what they think of when they think of innovation. And they say, I couldn't possibly be innovative because it's the Steve Jobs type of innovation that makes it. But the fact of the matter is, if we think about innovation, it's probably about doing what we all do, what you all do on a daily basis. And we'll talk about innovation on a continuum. To me, my big theme is solving problems. And innovation has to solve a problem that a customer cares for. It's about implementing solutions that work, and achieving excellent results. And I would imagine that all of us that can say that in our jobs, in our profession, every day we're doing that. So in my way of thinking, you're all innovators. Now, up until this point, I haven't truly defined innovation in terms of the context that we're going to be discussing today. And my definition of innovation is solving a problem, one that has been observed, that there's evidence of, not just a one-off, but we have repeated evidence of it, that a customer cares about. In fact, the customer cares enough about it that they are willing to pay for it. Because in the world that we are in the world of licensing, of course, what we care about is the commercial value of that innovation. If it is not creating value for our entities, it can be very nice, it can be doing a lot of interesting things, but it's not really terribly useful to us. So I think that idea of a problem, a customer's got to be willing to pay for it, and it's creating that value from a commercial perspective is very important. Now, when we think about where innovation was even 40 years ago, this is supposed to be a picture of the first Mac in 1984. And you can think now about how that Mac has evolved to be a phone that's in the 14th or the 15th generation, and the number of bytes and that are on the chip, et cetera. We can see that, innovation progresses over a period of time. And we're going to talk about the time element. I have a definition of innovation, and I do think that Jobs and Bezos emulate it. It's an insatiable curiosity. People that are just as a default constantly asking questions, constantly testing, never happy with the status quo, a passion for problem solving, a willingness to embrace and encourage change. And I think increasingly we realize that it's about diversity of opinion, diversity of thought, diversity of background. And there's a lot of evidence to show that the greater the diversity on the team, between the organizations, the better the innovations, right? The more creative the innovations are going to be. Now, what I'd like to suggest is appeal to all of you as innovators, as I've stated, and ask you just to take a moment and take my quick diagnostic with me, if you will. And if you're so brave, you can post your score in the box and Mike can read them out. But on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your innovative mindset currently, looking at those 4 characteristics? And I'll pause so that you all can give me some feedback on your own innovation mindset. Mike, you may have to break the ice and go first.
All right. I was feeling, I don't know. I only put a 6 in for me. I'm not sure that I'm that innovative lately.
Okay. Anybody want to give themselves more than a 6? Thumbs up, thumbs down. All right. Will you hold that thought? And I'm going to tell you a quick story. So I do consulting and workshops and training at a number of organizations, including pharma. And I was at a big pharma that you might know. They're in the northern part of New Jersey, and their name is Novartis. And I was asked to meet with the sales team for the very small rare disease franchise at the time, because they've come a long way in the last few years. And I put this question up there, and everybody in the room, when I went around, because I was in person, and I asked them to raise their hand, interestingly, nobody gave themselves a 10. One person thought he was a 10, but he said he didn't give himself a 10 because then throughout the whole workshop, the bar would have been raised and everybody would have had very high expectations of him. But everybody else gave themselves 8s or 9s. So I said, well, I'm here to spur and create an environment where we can innovate, find out the problems that you're trying to solve. So if you all are 8s and 9s, it doesn't sound like you really need me. So what's going on? Why are you 8s and 9s and you need some assistance with getting your innovative ideas out there to commercialize? And you can imagine, if you've ever worked in a large corporation or the large organization or institution that you work in now, what I heard was, I'm innovative, we're innovative. The problem is this behemoth that I work in, it's not innovative. It's throwing up obstacles. We've got resistance. Projects get unfunded, they get defunded. We talk a good game, but at the end of the day, it is so much work to try to bring a new idea forward. It's just easier to not make any waves and go with the status quo. Now, that's sad, I know, but it's true. And I've been in large corporations as well, Bristol Myers Squibb and Cognizant and IBM, some of the biggest. And so we all have experienced that. And that's really what started my research for the second book, which is looking at corporate innovation. What are the blockages to innovation in organizations, and what can we do about it? And so I have interviewed 125 executives across various industries in order to understand how innovation's done in their companies. What are the issues? What are the risks? What are some of the things that we can do about it? So that's where a lot of this content that we're going to discuss comes from. But before we get into that, I want to go and give you a few examples of innovation, because as I mentioned, I believe that innovation in its various forms sits on a continuum. And as licensing professionals, you're going to recognize this too, right? You're going to say that every deal is a little bit different based on the quality and the level of the innovation. Now, Mike, this is a cartoon of what? You can just call it out for me.
A driver's seat, well, a car.
Yeah, the autonomous car. All right. So another quiz for anybody who's interested, and we have some IP people here who probably come from the automotive industry, so you may know this. But does anybody know when the first autonomous car was designed and tested? Okay, think about that. Well, it was in the 30s, and it was General Motors. And the first autonomous car was actually showcased at the World's Fair, which was in New York in the year that it was shown. Now, it's interesting to think about this because in 1932, the country of Saudi Arabia was established. And in 1938, ostensibly the largest oil well was found by an American company, and oil, petroleum, gas powered cars became obviously a huge industry. So work on the autonomous car by GM was shelved for the next 20, 25 years until they brought it out again in the 50s. And since then, the research on it has progressed. I think it's interesting that in 1984, the Department of Defense issued a challenge grant. Carnegie Mellon University answered it, as did a number of other universities, and they tested an autonomous tank because the government was interested in reducing troop fatalities, and they thought if they had autonomous tanks out in the field when we were still fighting wars in tanks and not with AI, it would be a life-saving type of measure. If you fast forward, there was as recently as 2 years ago, a collaboration between Volkswagen and Ford called Argo to bring the first autonomous vehicle to the marketplace so that you and I could purchase it like we might an electric car. And after they spent $3.5 billion on it, they scratched it. It's a lot of money to spend, right? And they scratched it because they realized that they just still couldn't work through a lot of the operational bugs, the regulatory bugs, how consumers were going to use this. They just kind of ran out of steam. And all of the pundits said, oh, research on the autonomous driving car is dead. It's never going to come back again. Now, what do you think of that? I mean, we all know that that's not true. It's just that some types of innovation take a lifetime or 2 or 3. And so we get to touch a part of the big elephant in terms of developing them. And some of the licensing things that you might be working on might be a long stretch of something that's really disruptive. And I call this kind of innovation the big hunt. Maybe that's the kind of innovation you're involved in, maybe not. A second type, I can't see you all, but if any of you are men and you have hair loss, you might recognize this product. Rogaine is for male pattern baldness, and it was first, the story behind it is the Upjohn company, again in around the early 80s, was working on minoxidil. And minoxidil at the time was a product that was used to treat refractory hypertension. And lo and behold, back in the day, I was at the NIH at the time, the clinical trials were almost all conducted in middle-aged white men. They had male pattern baldness, a number of them. And in the clinical trials, they noticed that they were growing hair. Now, the Upjohn company quickly pivoted, an important aspect of having an innovative spirit, and they prioritized their program for male pattern baldness over refractory hypertension. Rogaine launched before the medical indication, and it went on to become a blockbuster. It's a generic today, but still available and widely used. And the refractory hypertension indication followed a few years later. So what's this kind of innovation? You all are in the world of licensing. You probably would have loved to have been at Upjohn at that particular time and have been licensed minoxidil and had a lot of cash dropped off at the door in those early days. But I call this serendipity. It's alluring. It's a little bit like winning the lottery. We all think and hope it's going to happen to us, but again, very small rate of success that this is the kind of innovation that we're going to be involved in, but a wonderful type if you are part of it. Now, this is a picture of the skyline of LA. And at the time, I was involved, this is a personal story, I was involved in a technology out of a lab in Tel Aviv. And I was working with an LA-based technologist who wanted to bring this technology into the US. And the technology was a diagnostic that could test oxidative stress. And oxidative stress is a byproduct of a lot of diseases. And the colleague contacted me, asked if I would help him think through the marketing of it. So we stood up a company, we got a who's who of advisors, and we started testing all of these different indications. It could be used for selection of embryos and in vitro fertilization. It could be used for determining whether somebody with congestive heart failure should be released from the hospital. It could be used to detect symptoms and signs of Parkinson's disease. And therein lied our problem. We had this very interesting technology. We were leading with the technology, but we ran out of money and interest trying to find an application for it. I call this the field of dreams. If anybody's ever watched the famous Kevin Costner film where Shoeless Joe Jackson comes to the character that Kevin Costner plays, and he says, "Build it and they will come." He builds a ball field in the middle of a cornfield in Iowa. This is the kind of innovation that I see most often. And I would imagine as licensing professionals, you do too. Somebody has developed a technology, they're really excited about it, they want to either bring it in or out license it. But the problem is, and you probably have to have these conversations with them, what's it going to be used for? Who's going to want it? Is it going to have a market fit? What is the commercial potential of it? And honestly, in all of the innovation counseling that I do, advice to startups and principal investigators and early stage entrepreneurs, and even in pharma companies, this is what I see 98% of the time. Okay, so let's talk about the kind of innovation that I think makes a big difference. And I'm going to tell you a real quick personal story. So when I was 12 years old, my dad, who was a serial inventor, S-E-R-I-A-L, he did not invent Cheerios, was always challenging my brother and myself around the house. My brother was younger than me, to find 3 solutions to every problem he would identify. And he was always finding problems around the house. One summer, to make his point, he took us to the Hot Shops cafeteria in, at the time, Wheaton, Maryland, for anybody here who's from the DC, Baltimore area. And as you can see, we sat in these big booths, red vinyl booths, for 3 mornings in a row in the summer, eating our scrambled eggs and enjoying our orange juice. But we weren't there just for breakfast, because my dad told us that we had a job to do. And he wanted us to figure out what was slowing down table turnover. He gave us a stopwatch, a notebook, a 3-color pen, and to make this real, he also talked to the manager of the restaurant about this project. And so we had access to interview the waitresses and the busboys. And after 3 days, we figured out what the culprit was. Might be a surprise, might not, but it was the simple thing of these pesky sugar packets that at the time people were putting in their coffee or their tea, spewing them all over the table and the floor, and our stopwatch indicated how long it was taking to clean them up. So in the spirit of 3 solutions, we designed one that we took to prototype. We called it the Sugar Cube. It held the packets, it held the trash from the packets, it had 4 sides for advertising. We took it to the manager, she loved it. Within 6 months, the Sugar Cube was produced, and it was in the Hot Shops cafeteria throughout the Baltimore, Washington area. We had some revenues that came in from it, but the real fun part of the story was shortly thereafter, Hot Shops was purchased by the Marriott company. And so for a short window of time, the Sugar Cube was in the Marriotts. So I learned from my dad that solving problems was fun. I didn't know that I was innovating. I didn't know I was coming up with commercial market fit. I just knew that I had a great time and it was somewhat lucrative. So fast forward 20 years later. I'm working for a small biotech company based in Pennsylvania. They have one drug that has been used for a cardiac indication. And the scientists there have decided that they want to work on an area of unmet need. There has not been a new drug for Crohn's disease in 40 years. Okay, Crohn's disease patients, a terrible gastrointestinal condition, autoimmune condition, are still taking methotrexate. It's the gold standard and very subpar in terms of its efficacy. So this company decided that they were going to tackle that problem. And they set about looking at a mechanism called the anti-tumor necrosis factor pathway. Maybe you all are getting warmed up in terms of what this is. But it wasn't easy because we were still in the age where the only biologic that had ever come to the market was insulin. And so there was a lot of fear because, as you can tell, this drug had to be developed from monoclonal antibodies, right? So it was one of the first biologics after insulin that was being designed and developed. You all might be too young to know, but there was a lot of media frenzy over this sheep called Dolly that had been cloned. And so there was a lot of misinformation because I was working on this drug with them. Everybody was afraid that it was going to, cause adverse events. They didn't want mouse cells in their body. And undaunted, this company had to address all these issues. They were patient, they stuck it out. And the drug Remicade, brought to market by Centocor, now also is a generic and changed the face not only of Crohn's disease, but rheumatoid arthritis. And it is a wonderful story about how one goes through the systematic process of understanding a problem, breaking it down, and then working to solve it. And so in my experience with Centocor, Remicade, as you probably know, this success was the reason that Johnson & Johnson purchased Centocor. I think they since have spun off Remicade, but it actually was able to give J&J its biologic capability. They didn't develop it in-house. They bought it when they acquired Centocor in this first flagship product. So what do sugar packets and Remicade have in common, at least to me? It's that the problem-based innovation has the highest hit rate. This is the one that I recommend. Now, I said that innovation is along a continuum. And so even in this problem-based category, we have some subsets, right? So there are brand new solutions, brand new problems that we're solving with new solutions that have never existed before. This company, Emulate, which I think is very interesting, has figured out how to put an organ on a chip. The reason this is relevant is because a lot of work in the early stages of research and discovery is trying to simulate what a disease, what it's going to react to, or what its reaction is going to be in the human body. And so this allows them to emulate the disease in the body, to look at pharmacogenomics and other types of studies very early on without having to do anything invasive. That's pretty good technology. I also like to talk a little bit about Ultima Genomics, a startup that has since worked on miniaturizing genomic sequencing until they've been able to do the sequencing of the genome on a chip. Now, this is interesting technology too, but we might describe this more as optimization. And maybe some of the projects that you're involved, maybe some of the licensing that you're doing has an excellent market. It's incremental, but it's optimizing something, right? Still really valuable innovation. It's something that companies can be willing to pay a lot for. And then finally, recursion and metagenomics are examples of what I like to call renovation, right? And this is when we take an existing technology and we apply it to new use cases. So we can think about metagenomics, which is looking at omics technology, and they are using it for gene editing in certain types of diseases, right? So taking that gene editing technology and the basis of it and now applying it to new therapeutic areas. Or recursion, which has figured out how to use AI to make drug discovery go that much faster. They had some very successful acquisitions over the last year or two. So these represent renovation. So again, along the continuum, just food for thought, the kind of innovation that you're involved in, out licensing, in licensing, what kind of category is it fitting? Because the value proposition, the financials, the customer marketplace, all of those are going to be different based on the stage of that innovation. Mike, let me just stop here before we go into corporate and see if there's any questions or comments.
None at the moment. I think we've got a quiet group today. We can keep moving.
Okay, all right. I will keep moving. So, now for the big question that I pose, what does innovation mean in a corporate environment? Well, first of all, we have to say, what do we mean by innovation and how are we measuring it? Has to start with that question. And so there are various means of measuring innovation. I've got a few of them on the slide. From a financial perspective, we can look at investor ROI. And Forbes publishes a list about every 2 to 3 years. They look at the ROI of different companies and then they rank them, the top 100. And so these are some of the companies from a life sciences perspective, and there's a whole range. So I know some of you come from different industries. You can look up the 100 because it's a cross section. But these are some of the well-known brands that you might recognize. And the way this list is derived, Forbes looks at the stock purchases of different investor groups and how much that group is influenced because it's very bullish on the future innovation that's going to come out of those companies. So shareholders are thinking 5 years ahead. Do I agree with the innovation in this portfolio? And I'm buying shares based on the future value of this company. That's their investor ROI. Fast Company has a slightly different model, also interesting, where they say, well, innovation is a lot more than just ROI. It's got to be the innovative company's reputation, right? Anymore, we're very much concerned about corporate justice and sustainability and different initiatives. What is their reputation in the marketplace? And are they a solid citizen? What is their social capital? What are people saying about them on social media? And again, are they a good citizen? What is their value creation strategy? Are they creating value for the long haul? Are they looking at quarter by quarter returns? And then again, this idea of investor equity for the future, kind of similar to the Forbes ROI. So we've got companies that are evaluated based on Fast Company. Then one that you all will be quite familiar with, what is the cost of not innovating? And I'm sure all of you sit in companies or work for companies or consult companies where that question comes up all the time. Should we take this risk? Should we not do anything in this space? Do we move into some other particular space? So obviously there's a marketplace risk of having a competitor gain your market share. And then there are what I call counting ways of looking at innovation. The inputs, how much are we doing something? How much are we implementing the process? For you all, how many patents are we filing? How many assets are in the pipeline? How many resources are we deploying, et cetera? So what are the inputs that are going into the innovation? And then outputs. How many patents are being granted? How many contracts do we have with customers? How many new partnerships? What are our customer satisfaction scores? And then, of course, the all-important, what are our revenues? So these are various ways the corporations can be evaluating innovation. And I'm sure some of them are relevant to you, and maybe your models that you create are a mix of the five. I'd be interested in knowing more about this. So moving on to the 5 C's, and we don't have to go through all the 5 C's. There's one in particular that I want to spend a little time on, and then I do want to pause and open this up to questions. But in my own research, what came out in terms of a framework for ensuring successful innovation within a large organization or small comes down to 5 factors that I call the 5 C's. The first one is chance. This is investing in risk. What is our approach, philosophy, intestinal fortitude for investing in risk, and how do we think about it and evaluate it? If you're going to be an innovator, you have to experiment. You can't have fear of failure. You've got to invest in risk. That's table stakes. The second one is collaboration. And when I was at Bristol Myers Squibb in the let's say 2000s, collaboration was just coming on the scene. It was introduced to human resources, and it was a behavior that needed to be incented, right? Everybody needed to be team oriented, so you needed to coordinate and collaborate. That's not the way it's used anymore. It's a business strategy. And I really like the work of Heidi Gardner. She's actually an attorney, and she teaches at Harvard Business School. She has written a book called, oh, I've got it here on my shelf, Smarter Collaboration. And what Heidi has done is look at what happens when everybody in the organization is aligned around a set of problems, strategic imperatives, customer needs. And this integration can be business functions, business lines. So it might be a service line, it might be a product line, it might be a new product line, but it's also service functions, because in her research, she found that if the IP attorneys, if the human resources, if contracting, if everybody, even in the service functions, are all aligned and working together, the opportunity to upsell and to cross-sell and to grow revenues exponentially increases, because everybody's now part of the solution. They're bringing different perspectives to bear. They all have a different perspective on the customer, on the problem. And she gives lots of great examples of businesses that have experienced exponential growth when all of these different functions and business units come together for the purpose of innovating. Culture obviously is critical. We probably need to lead with culture. And again, when we look at the research, the cultural characteristic that is most important in an innovative organization, and think about your own organization, is this idea of experimentation, no fear of failure. If we do experience some issues or obstacles, we're going to pivot. We're going to use it as an opportunity for continuous learning, but we don't view failing as a negative. It's a good thing. And, you know, one of the most famous innovators who has really helped to continue, this is still part of the culture, is Jeff Bezos and Amazon. You saw his cameo a little bit earlier, and he said, try, fail, learn, and unleashed a model in Amazon where they would have meetings, people would bring their ideas together, they would have a discussion about them. Not all of them would go to market, but they would all be commented on, and people got credit for bringing their ideas forward in these memos, whether they ended up going to market or not. And that is absolutely imperative. And we see more and more companies trying to create those kinds of cultures. Bezos and even Elon Musk and others also have adages. They say, you know what? Hire the right people and get the hell out of their way. So, you know, this idea of bringing in smart people into the culture and empowering them and giving them freedom to operate and the latitude to experiment and make mistakes is absolutely critical. And I think it's an important one for you to think about. And in terms of the organization and your ability to influence it, licensing is oftentimes at the forefront of thinking creatively and innovatively about where something's going to be a fit or not, or what potential it has. So, you know, do you have the latitude to experiment and fail? Do you express that, you know, with the individuals whose assets you're bringing to market? And then ultimately change. A lot of folks will say that innovation at its core is about change management. I don't disagree. You have to have a healthy attitude about change, and you've got to have a way of helping your organization work through and manage change. And of all of the ones on the slide here, honestly, this is the one that so many companies just struggle with. And as we said at the top of the hour, even with a company like Novartis, just being afraid to change because they are just so wedded to the ways that they've always done things. Now, just two more slides here, and then I'm going to turn it over to you all for some comment. But I was asked to comment on innovation in biopharma. And so I thought I would just take, you know, two areas that relate to the 5 C's. But I told you that my MO, my modus operandi is always around starting with the problem. So what is the current problem in biopharma? And in this situation, we're talking about large pharma. And you can see that I have a link here or reference to an article that was recently published in McKinsey. I thought it was pretty well done just last week, 2 weeks ago. And It's called Making More Medicines That Matter. And it's a commentary on the lackluster performance that continues to come out of pharma. So there was a spike during COVID, and we saw companies like Pfizer have exponential growth. And I mean, I think 350 companies were working on COVID vaccines or different treatments at the time. So if you take COVID out of the picture and you just rationalize it over the last 10 years, you see that the pharma industry's growth has just continued to lag behind. It's just remained in the single digits. And, you know, there's been a lot of focus on rare disease and orphans, and that was supposed to bolster the company. But the fact of the matter is there's still a focus on the blockbuster. And if they don't have an asset, and I'm going to give you an example in just a moment of an asset that can garner at least $1 billion in peak year sales, a lot of times these larger companies just don't feel as though it's worth putting the time and effort into it. And so, unfortunately, in terms of innovation in pharma, there is no correlation, according to this study, between R&D and the efforts in R&D and the spend in R&D and new molecular entity value creation. All right. In addition, pharma's got a lot of headwinds. There is the IRA implementation. So that is the initiative that came out of the Biden administration that was looking at monitoring and managing the budget for certain types of drugs, for example, insulin, right? That's being implemented. There's still patent expirations in this sector. There's the threat of biosimilars, which are finally coming on the scene in the same way generics were. And then there's in-licensing competition. I'm sure that you all are aware of that. There's a little bit of herd mentality, you know, now that everybody is interested in CRISPR and gene editing, et cetera. You know, everybody wants to partner with Mammoth Biosciences, for example, a big partner with Regeneron, a partner with Bayer through a new company that they founded. So there's competition, and that drives up the price of licensing or working with any of these particular companies. And so if you look over to the right, this is some of the antidote for change that is mentioned in this article. And the one that I want to bring up is this investor-like approach to managing the pipeline, right? And I think this will be relevant to all of you. And then another one is innovating with the external ecosystem. And there are other characteristics that you can see as well if you want to read the article, other areas for change. But let's just look to two of them. So this first one about chance I want to discuss. I don't know whether any of you have seen the work of this 2012 Harvard Business Review article by Bansi Nagali and Jeff Tuff, but it's called the 70-20-10 Rule of Portfolio Management. Now, the fact of the matter is they have published this article on it. It's worthwhile to read this article. As licensing professionals, I think you'd really enjoy it. But the fact of the matter is the 70-20-10 golden rule, as it's sometimes dubbed, was the brainchild of none other than Sergey Brin of Google. And he came up with this mathematical equation in 2004. And when he did his own research and investigation, he determined that at least in his industry, this combination of how to manage a portfolio was the best combination for driving growth, steady growth over the long haul. They have since, this team at HBR did some additional research, they interviewed some companies, and so they, published this diagram. But what it's saying is that there are three different types of innovation. The core, which is optimizing existing products. And I showed you some slides that talked a little bit about opportunities to optimize, whether it was something like Ultima Genomics or Renovate when it was Recursion. But these are things that you're investing close to the core. The second one are adjacencies. So these kinds of innovations might take you into a new market sector. So let's say that we have a drug for adults with a certain kind of disease, but we study it a little further and we find out that it can also be used for children with a different kind of disease. That's a very simple example. You might think of different examples about what happens when a company like Coca-Cola maybe adds a whole new product line and it appeals to a different purchaser than the mainstream. Like when they got into water, et cetera, flavored waters, and they got into health conscious sectors. And then that third yellow area is transformational. So these are the breakthroughs, the innovations that nobody's thought about yet, markets that don't exist. So we have lots of examples of this, in terms of the iPhone and some of the very, popular ones that you might be thinking about. And so the thing that's interesting to me about this matrix is threefold. Number one, if you use this to think about your assets, and from a licensing perspective, you could start to put them in these buckets. You can think a little bit more strategically about where you're investing, where your revenues are going to come from, how you categorize these assets, and are you diversified? And does diversification mean anything to you? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. For consumer goods, for tech companies, for the industrial sector, this model makes a lot of sense. In the world of software, because you have to innovate every 6 months, it might not make so much sense. Maybe you innovate a little bit more close to the core, but it gives you a way to think about it and discuss it. But interestingly, and rebalance it, but interestingly, in the study that they did, the 70-20-10 rule showed that growth 5 years later was inversely correlated with this algorithm. So 5 years later, in these companies where they tested this, 70% of new growth 5 years later was coming from the 10% of disruption. 20% was coming from the adjacencies, and only 10% of growth 5 years later was coming from core. Now, these are pretty, I think, significant statistics. And again, is it something where you're going to plug everything into this? Absolutely not. But is it a good tool to facilitate discussion in your organization about how you're thinking about your investments, about how you're thinking about where you're going to invest for licensing, and maybe tracking what the value metrics are 5 years later? Maybe so. So I give it to you for that purpose. And the second one is about this external partnership model. And I was asked to comment on this. And the reason that I have these two companies on the slide, I'm just going to talk about one, and that is Provention Bio. And I don't know whether you all were tracking the news if you're in the pharma space last December, January, but Provention Bio was a company that was co-founded by a good colleague of mine from Bristol Myers Squibb, Francisco Leon. And he and his partner, his business partner, they were actually working on a problem. They wanted to do research on the thymus gland, but there were a lot of reasons why the science wasn't quite evolved yet, where they could earn money, raise capital and set up a company. So they decided to do the next best thing. They both had backgrounds in autoimmunity. And so they licensed, maybe from some of you, they licensed 6 assets into Provention. What I think is really interesting about this is they paid no upfront costs. These were just assets that were sitting in a basket. They were being completely ignored, which happens, of course. They licensed them in. One of them hit gold, 1.9 billion, as a matter of fact. And their asset for type 1 diabetes, it's kind of a type 1 diabetes prevention vaccine. It helps for those individuals that are at risk of developing type 1 diabetes, and actually it is a process by which you do develop it. It can slow or delay the process of developing type 1 diabetes. That one hit. They sold it to Sanofi for $1.9 billion in the January timeframe. They raised $28 million in their seed fund. Now, those are pretty smart numbers. Now, you might say, well, that sounds like serendipity, Lorraine. Well, maybe so. But I think this whole idea of being able to bring those assets in for no price up front and just promise something on the back end was really creative of them, and it did well. Bristol Myers Squibb, at the other end of the spectrum, which is my alma mater, has a very small portfolio now of in-licensed compared to where its big revenues are coming from, right? And there are two big revenue drivers at Bristol Myers Squibb. One of them is Eliquis, and then there's a second drug. I'm drawing a blank on it right now, but 80% of BMS's revenues are coming from two blockbusters. And while they're still investing and making acquisitions, et cetera, it's a small part of their efforts. And then you look at a company, a really interesting oncology company like Incyte, which has grown from a startup into a very impressive, small to mid-sized company, and is doing its own acquisitions now. It's not only partnering with the big companies, but it's also doing its own in-licensing of assets and growing its. So very different examples of companies on the spectrum in terms of their stage and their licensing. And so I think what it shows us is, in this world where you as licensing professionals exist, the ability to do deals with and between companies is very different. If it's a startup mindset type of company like a Prevention, if it's more of an emerging mindset company, which Incyte was at a certain point in time, whether it's a growth oriented company, which Incyte has evolved into, which is really interesting, or whether it's a corporate mindset like a Bristol Myers Squibb. And so their needs, how they think about innovation, where they invest, it's all going to be slightly different based on where they sit in the ecosystem.